hopefully everybody's okay in terms of why they involve volunteers. I'm happy enough for that. Okay, so why you involve volunteers. Just want to highlight some actual reasons which were given by volunteer involving organisations and people within them. And then I'd like to hear from you guys. So these are some of the, we call them second choice reasons, potentially where volunteering is viewed as cheap labour. We involve volunteers because, well, if we had enough money, we wouldn't need or even want volunteers. And secondly, we don't necessarily want volunteers, but since we don't have more money, would you do us a favour and help out? Okay? As a very motivated, as Anne said, the energy, the enthusiasm, the innovation that volunteers can bring. If someone's saying that to me, you've just deflated me. That's why you want to involve me. That's using me. Okay? We've spotted that difference already. These are some of the first choice reasons which organisations said. They want volunteers because they have a unique contribution to make, and we welcome volunteers who can contribute on and off the pitch. We welcome volunteers because their support shows that the community really wants this organisation to succeed. Okay, so does your organisation have a real community link where you can actually offer the two-way relationship? And most notably, volunteers add an extra range of skills, flexibility, experience and fresh ideas that would not exist without their involvement. A volunteer can often bring something into a think tank session that a staff member can't. A volunteer can often give more time dedicated to certain roles which a staff member could not. Okay, pressure's on now. A couple of volunteers, please, in terms of why you involve volunteers. What did you put as your strapline or your thinking in terms of your organisation? Any hands before I start picking on a few tables for why you involve volunteers? Cahill, yep. Okay. Being part of a team, that's what it offers in terms of the volunteer, helping the event succeed. That two-way relationship, not only as a volunteer, but also then as an event organiser, the two-way relationship. Excellent. Everybody hear that okay, yeah? Yeah, okay. Super, thank you. Yes, please.
John from Belfast. We provide the backbone, you provide the flesh on the bone.
We provide the backbone, you supply?
You provide the flesh on the bone.
Isn't that brilliant? Have you thought of this already, or is that the first time you've thought about why you involve volunteers?
I just thought of it today, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe you haven't even thought of this question before, but when you do think about it, it actually is. We've got our backbone, now we need the meat. Okay, how do we need that to support, and in turn then how can one match the other? Okay, that can be your strapline, most definitely. Super, thank you. Hard act to follow in those two, but one more, please. Yes, thank you.
International culture.
Yep.
Bring volunteers in from mainland Europe, the organisation I belong to. And it's international with the young people to see different culture and they work with different cultures. I can learn about different languages as well.
Okay. So Rita, you involve volunteers. Just go through the strapline again of it then.
It's an international culture.
Yep.
Introduce young people to cultures from other countries.
Yes.
Also it helps them to learn another language.
Okay, so it's not only introducing young people to something potentially new, but also providing them with a skill to maybe take forward or develop further. Okay, excellent. Thank you, our three volunteers there. I really appreciate the input. So your first and second choice reasons. As I said, there's so many guides that you can use that across in terms of your recruitment, in terms of your annual report, in terms of publicity, in terms of funding, potential criteria. What I'd also say is in terms of induction, in terms of saying to your volunteers, what a great opportunity to say we involve volunteers because, or as staff members, okay, your induction for your staff members, your finance, if you're lucky enough to have different departments, may say, well, I don't have anything to do with volunteers, so why do I need to know why they involve them? Well, actually, you're providing out-of-pocket expenses. It's the volunteer who's having to put that into place. So to ensure that that's streamlined, isn't it helpful to know why you involve those volunteers and why you want to pay them out-of-pocket expenses? Okay, so volunteering impacts on every job within an organisation and vice versa. Okay, so it's important that the whole team know why they involve volunteers, not just those who are directly involved with maybe their recruitment or their selection or their management. Okay. I touched before on the unique contribution, and I just want to highlight that volunteer involvement can have legal implications if you treat volunteers the same as staff members. And this is part of what we were asked to outline today. I don't want to scare people off, but I do want them to recognise that best practice is there for a reason. Volunteer management structure is there within the volunteering community infrastructure, so avail of that and do put it into place. So for example, we carry out health checks, which are free to volunteer involving organisations, whereby we benchmark your organisation for where you are in your volunteer management practice. Okay? It identifies gaps. That's what it's there for. It's not weaknesses, it's just gaps. And through those gaps, actually, the development officer who comes out and carries out that check will then also write a report based on those gaps, and that will be your development plan for taking forward your volunteer management. And I say that is a free resource that we offer, and that's almost your first step onto investing in volunteers, to benchmark where you as an organisation are. So is anybody here aware that you can accidentally contract with a volunteer? Okay. You most certainly can, and I just want to outline in terms of contract of employment that it's not a piece of paper, but a relationship where an individual and an organisation where there's three areas, either in terms of obligation, consideration or intention. Okay, so that is obligation potentially around that job substitution, where there's an employer, okay, who has an obligation to provide work, and an individual an obligation then to do the work. Okay. In terms of consideration, this is where you just have to be very careful, and we'll draw on this later, in terms of what you're giving your volunteer. Okay? In terms of remuneration, but also something else of value, that consideration. And finally, the airy-fairy one in many respects where it comes down to interpretation is around intention. A legally binding contract is intended or implied. And through that, that is where the court will look at what is intended by both parties, see if there's obligation or consideration on either side, and from that, then intention that a contract was implied. Okay? Just want to highlight a couple of cases. And as I say, these are rare, but it's worth knowing that actually we do have to have some structure and framework in place to support us involving volunteers and to take it forward effectively. So we had Chowdhury versus the Immigrant Advice Service. Mrs Chowdhury was a volunteer who was paid flat rate expenses of £25 per week, which later increased to £40 per week. She lived nearby and walked to her volunteering, and she actually went home for her lunch. And she received expenses whenever she was sick or on holiday. Mrs Chowdhury then took a race discrimination case against the Immigrant Advice Service. And volunteering, you cannot take a racial discrimination case if you're a volunteer. That does not apply to employment legislation. Mrs Chowdhury argued that she was an employee, or in fact she's a volunteer. So based on that evidence, was she a volunteer or was she an employee? Show of hands please for volunteer. Okay. Show of hands for employee. Show of hands for who's sitting on the fence. Okay. You are indeed right. She was an employee. Okay, because she received consideration which was not related to out-of-pocket expenses. Okay, so she didn't have any travel in terms of either mileage or bus receipts or train, and she went home for her lunches, so she had no out-of-pocket expenses. Okay, so she actually then was an employee and won her racial discrimination case then as an employee. Okay. Another one in terms of Armitage versus Relate. Mrs Armitage was obliged to contribute a minimum of 600 hours of her volunteering and required to repay any training costs if the minimum number of hours was not completed. And in turn, they operated a practice of offering volunteers the opportunity of paid work after 3 years. This was sexual and racial discrimination she wished to take, and they said, but you're a volunteer, and she tried to argue that no, she was an employee. So your thoughts? Is she a volunteer? Okay, was she an employee? Okay, quite a few sitting on the fence on this one. Okay, she was actually an employee. Okay, because there was obligation to do the work. Okay, and often what I say in that terms is outline that there's an expectation, or you noted in your application you're willing to provide. Okay, so be clear in terms of that. An obligation then most certainly brings into that consideration. Okay, and therefore she was able to sue relate under the employee legislation. One more example, where we have Gradwell versus the CVS Blackwell. This is where the volunteer signed a written agreement. There was no minimum time commitment or obligation to attend meetings or training, and out-of-pocket expenses were reimbursed. Volunteer or employee? Volunteer? Employee? Okay. Well done. Okay, they were not an employee. Okay, no consideration was for paid work. There was no obligation there in terms of them turning up or what they were intended to imply. And most notably, the volunteer signed a written agreement. That's an agreement. It is not a contract. Okay, so don't get worried by, oh, but we wanted our volunteer to come on board to give us our ethos and to sign the agreement and to be a member of our team. That is not a legally binding contract. It is one of honour. Okay, so please don't get scared off by that. What I would say is, if you want further information on that, we have a very informative fact sheet for volunteers on the law, which is downloadable off our website. So please feel free to go on that, and that will inform you of all the boundaries. But what I would say is the volunteer management best practice that we're highlighting today will support you in taking that forward so that there is a clear definition. I just want to highlight some of the key principles with regards to the recruitment of volunteers. Organisations must have a clear value base for involving volunteers. So when you thought on your postcard, we involve volunteers because, did you think about it as a value base? In terms of, well, we couldn't deliver, well, we organised training, well, actually, they are our deliverables, our deliverers, sorry, in terms of what the volunteer engagement is. Okay, so your ethos towards why you involve volunteers. The needs of the organisation and the needs of the volunteer must be met. Okay, so think about these as your key recruitment principles, because if you have that two-way in place, then you've got not only a happy volunteer, but you've got an effective volunteer. Okay? A clear role with full information about what is required is important. Okay, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's why I was delighted whenever Anne outlined 4 clear roles. Okay, clear in terms of what they are, what they will involve, what's required for them. And also then with those, it ensures that people are aware of what is required from them coming on board for a volunteer role. Okay, so your role descriptions will be key to that. Making it easy for people to volunteer. So we spoke about that earlier in terms of breaking down those barriers, okay, to ensure that people can volunteer. The image of the organisation is important. So we spoke about that in terms of potentially your illustrations. What I'd also say about that is, especially within the events and especially within tourism, you will not get enough number of staff to be able to engage with visitors, but you will get volunteers. Okay, so they will often be your image. And if you have not informed them, if you have not valued them, if you have not given them the information which they require then to be able to engage with others, either an ambassadorial or for an information perspective, then how is that going to reflect on your image? Okay, so certainly do not undervalue what that engagement can offer in terms of your brand. And a well thought through recruitment message is key. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of that volunteer engagement and your opportunity to get it right, because the framework's there to support it. Just want to highlight then some of the key principles in terms of the selection side of things. That having the wrong volunteers is worse than having no volunteers at all. Okay? And that is where a good selection process is really helpful. What I would be saying about that is it's applicable to the role. Okay, so don't be thinking that we need to put together a vast application, then we need to put together a team to be able to sift it, then we need to be able to put a programme in place in terms of an interview, and then from there we'll go through checks, and then from there we'll select, and then we'll look at who's managing. For some of your roles you will have to do that potentially. Okay, either because they're very, very competitive or because they've got certain restrictions around them, i.e. maybe handling cash or dealing with young people. Okay, but don't put any barriers up in terms of those people, but do recognise that they're wrong volunteers. Take all reasonable steps to ensure that unsuitable people are prevented from volunteering. Okay, so if checks are required for a particular role and it's a regulated activity, do put those checks in place. Okay, people expect those if there's particular rules, so they're not actually a barrier. People see them as a safeguarding, both for themselves, for the organisation, and potentially for vulnerable groups or for young people. So there is an expectation there if the rule is applicable to that. Selection procedures is necessary but should be in keeping with the type of rules. Okay, so that's what I said earlier. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Keep them in check with whatever the rule may be. And all volunteers must go through the same selection procedure for the same role. Okay, so we all know a neighbour, we all know a friend, we all know a family member who may help out. But there could be 50 of these roles that you want to recruit. Make sure that everybody goes through the same process in terms of even if that's just registering their details. Keeps you right as an organisation in terms of your insurance, but also then if you have any recognition, you know what volunteers were involved, somebody's not slipping through the net. Okay, this is particularly important when it comes to major events. Okay, because it helps you identify how many volunteers were involved. It helps you ensure that you have insurances, the clear rules. It ensures that all parity has been across for those different roles to ensure that nobody can come back and say, well, I've no time for that organisation or that event or that business, because actually I know somebody who just came in there at the last minute, especially for large events where people are involved maybe in a one-year recruitment drive and they came in at the last minute and got a role. Okay, so be clear in terms of the same role, that it's the same selection procedure then. Equality of opportunity for all. We all have prejudices in some shape or form, even if we don't realise them at times. So try and leave those at home. And often we can, as said, recruit from those who are like-minded in terms of what our personalities are. But actually the different varieties and the diversity and inclusiveness of what we can involve around volunteering will actually support you in delivering. So please leave those prejudices at home and inform all volunteers from the start, if you're having a selection procedure, that it is in place and it will be followed and that not all candidates will be successful. Okay, keeps you right that people know there may be a very competitive role and actually there may be disappointment, but that organisation let me know. If they didn't let me know and all of a sudden I get a letter or a phone call, well, I don't think much of them, and I'm certainly not going to be championing them within my community or recommending someone to go to them. Okay, so just be clear on those opportunities. So in terms of our next session and where we're going, we are going to have a coffee break because you're going to talk with some of the fellow attendees here to see what your motivations are behind involving volunteers. But we're also going to be looking at tools then that we can take away after today to give a bit of thought for what we've got in terms of good practice and how we can put that into place across the roles that we're going to develop. So these may seem like a lot of things to consider now before you've even volunteers through the door, potentially, or you've already got volunteers saying, oh no, don't want to go through that. But actually time now, time invested now, most certainly saves time later on. And effective planning for volunteer involvement will hopefully mean that you're prepared for almost every eventuality. Okay? So in terms of our recruitment plan for volunteers, this has been developed from grassroots. Frontline volunteer involving organisations, tried and tested. Failures looked at and reviewed, and this is what works, not only for effective volunteer recruitment, but for effective retention of volunteers. Okay? So these are the steps involved in this. Why does the organisation want to involve volunteers? Hopefully we've given some thought to that already in terms of why you want to involve volunteers. What do you want the volunteers to do? Okay, I want them to be Mac navigators. I want them to be marshals. I want them to be meter and greeters. Okay, what do you want them to do? Your role description. We're going to touch on that in the next session. In order to do that, what skills or qualities are required? Okay, so touching on earlier, is it that no experience is necessary, or in order to do it, will training be provided? Okay, what skills or qualities are required? Many people thought this would be the first one. Okay, how are you going to find the volunteers? Do not jump to question 4, or to point 4, sorry. If you jump to point 4, you may find your volunteers. Okay? You'll have pretty big attrition rate, but certainly whenever it comes to your event the next year, or when it comes to your next recruitment, those same people are not going to be there. Okay? Because you've just found them willy-nilly. You haven't thought about why you involve them, what you want them to do, and what skills and qualities. So we had an organisation that recently got a spot, it's about 18 months ago or so now, on a local radio station. And they said they wanted volunteers. Okay? Sexed it up, made it very attractive to people who may wish to engage with it. And they turned up that Saturday. They had 10 roles available, and they got just under 100 people turning up. And they weren't delighted. They nearly died off because they hadn't thought they'd get that many people for a start. Okay? They hadn't thought about what exactly they wanted them to do, or they hadn't exactly relayed that, okay? So the volunteering wasn't for that Saturday, it was for the next Saturday. The actual volunteering, this was just turning up, okay? So they already had people dropping off, their brand, their image, people going away dissatisfied, okay? And confused about, well, why are they involving volunteers? If they don't know, how do I know? Okay? The volunteering was for the next Saturday. They also had to attend a training session during the week. Okay? They were given 2 different nights to be able to attend, so at least there was a bit of flexibility. But people weren't made aware of that in terms of that ad that initially went out when they jumped to point 4. Okay, so they had more drop off. Then they were informed of the venue of the volunteering, which was not where they were that Saturday. It's a different venue for the next Saturday, and they were informed that they'd have to make their own way there. Okay? A large number of the people were unable to make that. So they went from in the region, I think it was 97 to be precise, volunteers who turned up for 10 roles. They got down to 4 because they jumped to point 4. Okay? Which is really, really scary. So 93 people went away thinking, what a shambles. Why would I give my time to that organisation? And also, from a Northern Ireland PLC perspective, what's that volunteering all about? I'm not going to do that again. Because we want to support organisations to ensure that there's effective recruitment, to support you to be able to enable best practice is in place. Okay, so please, please do not jump to point 4. Think about that before you go any further. Then, in terms of our selection, so we went through some of our selection key principles. I would reinforce, please think about those in keeping with the role. Okay, so don't make them too many obstacles or barriers, but at the same time, if there's going to be competitiveness or there's going to be a level of requirement that's needed in terms of skills, then be clear in terms of what that selection procedure will be. Okay, some of them it may be a selection in terms of we just need your registration. Okay, maybe as simple as that. And finally then, how will you manage your volunteers whenever they are selected? And that management is absolutely key, because anybody who thinks volunteer management is simple, I don't think has actually volunteer managed. Because with employees, you have employment legislation, you have backup, you have very clear ground rules. With volunteer management, there are some structure in place, but there's no legal backup. Okay, so that's where your framework in terms of how you recruit volunteers is key to ensuring then that the management of them is actually more effective and efficient for you. What I would say finally, avoid going public until the plan is done. Okay, because you will create a momentum, an impetus, a level of engagement, and then if you haven't thought through the next stage, you're like, oh sugar, we're under pressure, we'll just do this. Or no, we won't do any of this because actually we can't deliver on this expectation. Okay, so go through your plan, think of the variables. It may seem like but 6 simple steps actually. You've carried out one of them already. You're going to be carrying out step 2 and 3 in the next session. Okay, step 4, I'm going to tell you how to do it. Okay, so it really, really is quite simple. And it is that time invested now saves time later on. So please don't be put off by that in any stage. As I say, we are going to move on to our roles and how we're going to put those into place. You'll find it where actually you have this tool to be able to come out of this session this morning and actually think from a tourism perspective, from a level of engagement with your organisation. What do we want to do? How can we engage with this? What is our titanic year and our giant opportunity to engage with all these volunteers who are willing and keen and very able to actually support your aim? I think that's us finished up for a coffee break on time. 1 minute. Just getting in a few last people. I'm delighted with the conversations that are going on at the moment. I know they're all around volunteering, which is excellent. We've even seen 2 new members join the table here, so we must have like-minded people, which is fantastic. Because I think also I want to highlight that that's what this event is about as well. Okay, and that's why we're delighted to engage with this insight, is for you to share your knowledge, your expertise, your experiences, your challenges. And to be able to see if there's people in the room who have experienced those as well, what their successes have been. So I think that's an invaluable opportunity, and that's why I welcome the insights on the different areas across all the tourism perspective, but certainly today from a volunteering side of things. So my last session, hopefully the glue is still there at the moment, and I want to keep you engaged for the next 20 minutes or so. Really want you to actually use this opportunity for your tool to be able to take out of this room to the next stage. So welcome your involvement in the session. We looked at our recruitment plan for volunteers and what we were going to do. So our postcard looked at how we were going to involve volunteers. Then what do you want them to do, and what skills or qualities does the volunteer require to have? You'll find on your table, hopefully everybody has one. If you don't, there's a few spare, in terms of a role description and a volunteer specification. Okay. This is clarification for you, and this is clarification for the potential volunteer who you want to recruit. What tasks need to be done, and what skills or qualities are required to do them. What I would say is that after you leave with this, you don't go out and put this into the public domain. It's not very sexy, it's not very attractive, okay? But it does give you everything that you need to consider for involving volunteers in a particular role. Okay, some of the stuff mightn't be relevant, so you can take it off, but you have considered it to ensure that you're actually in line with best practice, or so you can take away in terms of those phone calls with questions, emails with queries. They can self-select then. You can provide that opportunity for people to say, right, well, is this something that I wish to engage with or not, because you've been very clear. So what I want you to do, you can do it either if you're here with a couple of people from your own organisation, or individually, whatever works best for you, is to think about a role within your organisation. Maybe it's an existing role, which actually you haven't thought about what is involved here. You know, we've had this person on board in this role for 10 years, and they're an expert in it, they know it inside out, and we're delighted to have them. What happens when they leave? What goes with them? Have you asked them what is involved with their role? So that actually you could upskill someone to support them, not only in the delivery, but also maybe when they do want to step away from volunteering and leave a lasting legacy. How can you sustain that? Okay, so maybe from that perspective, an existing role, or maybe today has been a little bit of thought provoking for you. Okay, a little bit of, well, actually, here's a role which we haven't thought about, there's a need for in our organisation. Okay, so I want you to have a think about that. I'm going to give you about 12-15 minutes to go through in terms of these things you need to consider. What I would say is the role description is about the task. What do you need that person to do? The volunteer specification is about the person. What skills and qualities do they require to deliver the task which you have put together? Okay, so as I say, just about 12-15 minutes for you to have some thought. I'm more than happy to walk around the room, and if anybody's got any queries or anything they want to bring up that I can bring up at the end, that's not a problem. But at the moment, have a think about a role within your organisation and the role description for that and the volunteer specification. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Hopefully you found that useful in terms of our thinking of where we've come from today, in terms of involving volunteers to effectively involving them, okay, not using them as we may have thought prior to commencement. What I would say is being clear about what needs to be done then helps you identify who can do it. Okay, so going back to those motivations as well. What I would ask of you is to take those role descriptions away with you. They are your tool to take forward, to be able to think about. Look at some of the examples that are on websites for how they've been put together to make them slightly more attractive than a double-sided A4. Okay, but to pull out some of those key messages which you may wish then to give out to your potential public. Because I know over here we're talking about a link towards actually there's a potential recruitment pool to our volunteer opportunities. Okay, and that's what it's about. Bullet point 4, which we said not to jump to in terms of our recruitment plan for volunteers, was how to find them. And I'd like to offer you support in terms of how to find volunteers with regards to the Volunteer Now website, volunteernow.co.uk. That website not only provides the volunteer opportunities, but it allows you to go on as an organisation to register your opportunities, free of charge. And also with that, then you can put up as many roles as you have and put them up for as long or as short, depending on when the role is taken on board by a person. What I would say in terms of this is then whenever someone goes online, what they see, they put into a drop-down the area which they've got an interest in. Okay, there's tourism in there, there's events, there's health, there's education, there's younger people, there's older people. Your opportunity may actually hit a number of those, so tick those when you register your opportunities. The person puts into that drop down the area. They put in their postcode, how far they could or would be willing to travel. They put in, they hit the search engine, and it brings up the opportunities in their area. Okay, simple dating agency. So it's up to you to input that information so that they can then take out of it. Okay, in terms of if that's an event, if it's around tourism, if it's around meet and greet roles, if it's around older people engagement, whatever it may be, your opportunity to put in there. So first register your organisation on the website, then register the opportunities. And that's the central database for all volunteering here in Northern Ireland. Just want to put that up there. Their niceness will let you recruit a volunteer for the first time, but only your competence will let you keep them. Okay, so somebody will do you that favour. They will say, yes, I will help you out because I know you're in need or this organisation is in need. But yeah, whenever I turned up and it was 4 hours and wasn't told where the bathroom was or if I was allowed the water that was sitting in the corner, they're certainly not going to come back. And they're also not going to go away with a strong and positive image about your brand. Whereas actually if you re-recruit every time the volunteer turns up, you couldn't get a better ambassador. Okay, not only for Northern Ireland but for your organisation or your community. Okay, so please think about that when you're putting in place your recruitment. So, our aim of today, and hopefully I'm finishing off on time, don't want to eat into Paul's time. What we aimed to do was to create awareness of the importance of volunteering good practice in the tourism industry. So by the end of today, you will now be able to list the key concepts of volunteering. What's concept 1? Definition. Thank you. Okay. Second? Two-way relationship. Excellent. And third? Unique contribution. We've got our students down here doing well, thank you. Okay, so you're able to do that, outline the legal context for volunteer involvement, okay? So ensuring from that unique contribution that yes, the aim is the same, but the role or the job are very different. Okay, so outlining our legal context of where we are. Identifying the steps involved with the effective recruitment. Okay, why do we involve volunteers? We looked at that in our postcard session. What do we want them to do? We looked at that in our role description, flipping over. What skills or qualities are they required to do them? Okay? How do you find the volunteers then? Do not jump to step 4. Okay? Otherwise you'll just be going straight back to step 1. Okay? Go through this. Okay? So how are you going to find them? How are you going to select them? Is that required? And be open and honest in terms of if the selection procedure will be in place. And then how are you going to manage them? Okay? Simple. And all that's left for me really to say is thank you. I'm looking forward to the case studies which are going to be profiled in the next session through Paul and Marion. It's an opportunity to actually glean out what has worked Is there an opportunity for us to engage with something they're already doing as well? So do take those opportunities that are presented to you today. In terms of volunteering and taking forward, I would say please come on board if you want to be engaged with volunteering and what's going on in Northern Ireland to keep you updated on everything that may impact you or your organisation. You can sign up to be a member on our website quite simply. In terms of if you want to engage with any of the programmes that I've discussed, for example, the Impact Assessment Toolkit, the Event Management for Volunteers, and the Gold Mark, which is a programme which supports young people in volunteering, do get in contact and let us know. And we will signpost you to the person who takes the lead in that area across employer-supported volunteering, whatever it may be. It's a very much open-door policy. We've got a great complement of staff who are keen to engage with the people on the ground who know what they're doing, because we actually do a lot of volunteering ourselves, so we have to do what we practice, what we preach in many respects. So I'd just like to thank you, and I welcome the question and answers. But in the meantime, I'll hand over to Paul. Thank you ever so much.